Kursk, July 5, 1943. 0415 hours. The eastern steppe smells of diesel, crushed sunflowers, and rain that has not stopped for 3 days. Mud the color of wet cement grips the tracks of a brand-new German tank up to the road wheels. The crew inside can hear artillery opening 3 kilometers to the north. They can hear their own commander shouting through the intercom. What they cannot hear is the engine, because the engine has just caught fire. This is not a Russian shell, this is not a mine, this is not enemy action of any kind. This is a Panther, Germany's new supertank, rolling into the largest armored battle in history, and it is burning on its own start line. 40 minutes later, the crew is walking. The tank sits smoking in a field near Cherkasskoye. It has fired 0 rounds. It has killed 0 enemies. It has covered less than 2 kilometers of ground. And it is not alone. Along this entire sector of the front, the pride of German armor is dying in silence, not to T-34s, not to anti-tank guns. Dying to its own transmission, its own fuel pumps, its own final drives, dying before the battle even starts. This is the story of the Panther tank. You have heard the story 1,000 times. The Panther was the finest medium tank of the Second World War. A perfect balance of armor, firepower, and mobility. Sloped glacis plate borrowed from the T-34. A 75mm gun that could punch through a Sherman at 2,000 meters. A wide track that floated over mud the tigers would sink in. You will find this on every documentary, every magazine cover, every plastic model kit in every hobby shop from Tokyo to Toronto. Guderian himself praised it. Post-war American evaluators praised it. Soviet test crews praised it. And in a straight fight, weapon against weapon, range against range, they were right. The Panther was terrifying, but soldiers do not fight in straight fights. Soldiers fight in operations. And an operation depends on a tank that can actually reach the battle. A tank that starts in the morning and still runs at noon. A tank that does not set itself on fire. A tank that does not shed its final drive gears after 150 kilometers of road march. The Panther, in July 1943, could do none of those things. And its first major operation, Citadel, the offensive at Kursk, exposed a truth that German mythology has spent 80 years trying to bury. The Panther was not defeated at Kursk. The Panther defeated itself. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. More deep dives like this are coming. To understand what happened at Kursk, you have to understand what the Panther was supposed to do. And to understand that, you have to go back to the frozen summer of 1941, when German tank crews first saw the T-34 and realized in one awful afternoon that every armored vehicle in the Wehrmacht inventory was now obsolete. The T-34 had sloped armor. The Panzer III did not. The T-34 had a 76mm gun. The Panzer IV had a short 75. The T-34 had wide tracks that floated over spring mud. The Panzer III had narrow tracks that sank into it. Hitler demanded a counterweapon. The order went out in November 1941. By January 1942, 2 competing designs landed on his desk. One from Daimler-Benz, one from MAN. The man designed one not because it was simpler, but because it was heavier, more complex, and matched Hitler's instinct that bigger was better. Production was supposed to begin in December 1942. The first tanks were supposed to reach the front in May 1943. They were rushed. Hitler wanted them at Kursk. Kursk could not wait, and here is where it gets interesting. The Panther was not tested, not really. Prototype trials showed transmission failures, fuel leaks, engine fires, and final drive breakdowns. German engineers flagged every single one. Production engineers asked for time. Hitler said no. The Kursk offensive had already been delayed twice. The Panthers had to be there. So tanks rolled off the assembly line in Nuremberg, went straight onto rail cars, and arrived on the Eastern Front with faults their own factory foreman had warned about in writing. 200 Panthers were committed to Citadel, organized into 2 battalions, given to the 10th Panzer Brigade under Colonel Karl Decker. The brigade had less than 3 weeks of unit training before the battle. Most drivers had less than 50 hours behind the controls. The tanks had less than 200 kilometers on their odometers. Soviet armor doctrine relied on volume. T-34s by the thousand, shooting at close range, swarming German positions before superior German gunnery could pick them off. German doctrine, by 1943, relied on quality. One Panther kills 5 T-34s at long range, and the math works. But that math assumes the Panther is running, which means the moment your new wonder weapon starts breaking down before it reaches the enemy, your entire tactical logic collapses. Which means the brigade that was supposed to spearhead the southern pincer at Kursk is suddenly a collection of immobile steel boxes waiting for tow tractors. Which means the German offensive has no spearhead at all. Compare that to the American Sherman, fielded at the same moment. Crude gun, thin armor, gasoline engine that critics called a Ronson lighter because it supposedly lit on the first try. Everything a Panther was not. But a Sherman, in the spring of 1943, could drive 400 kilometers without a major breakdown. A Sherman could be fixed in the field with hand tools. A Sherman's transmission did not explode after 150 kilometers. A Sherman showed up to the fight. The Panther at Kursk often did not. Let us go to the battle itself. July 5, 1943. The Panther battalions belong to Grossdeutschland Division, attached to the 4th Panzer Army under Colonel General Hoth. Their objective is the village of Cherkasskoye, then the high ground beyond, then the road to Oboyan. They are supposed to lead. On the night of July 4, as the brigade moves up to its start line, 45 Panthers break down. Not from enemy fire, from mechanical failure on a road march, fuel pumps seize, final drives fail, transmissions grind themselves into scrap. 2 tanks catch fire from leaking fuel lines touching hot exhaust manifolds. The fires spread to adjacent vehicles. By dawn on July 5, the brigade that was supposed to lead the attack has lost a quarter of its combat strength before a single Soviet round has been fired. The survivors push forward. They enter a Soviet minefield that reconnaissance should have spotted. Another 36 Panthers are disabled. Some by mines, yes, but more by the fact that when a mine damaged a track, the Panther's recovery was so complicated and its weight so extreme that standard German recovery vehicles could not tow it. An 18-ton half-track trying to pull a 45-ton Panther out of mud under artillery fire is not a plan. It is a funeral. By the evening of July 5, after 1 day of combat, the 2 Panther battalions can field less than 40 operational tanks out of the 200 that started. Read that again. Less than 40 out of 200. 80% losses in 24 hours, with the vast majority caused by breakdown, minefield entanglement, and recovery failure. Soviet gunners killed some, most killed themselves. Karl Decker, the brigade commander, filed a report that German archives still hold. He wrote that the Panther was a formidable combat vehicle when it ran and a catastrophic liability when it did not. He wrote that his crews were brave, well-led, and technically competent. And he wrote that no amount of courage could compensate for a machine that broke down on its own start line. His recommendation was blunt. The Panther needed 6 more months of development before it was ready for a major offensive. He was overruled. The battle continued. The Panthers kept breaking. Compare this to what the Soviets were doing 2 kilometers east. The T-34s of the 5th Guards Tank Army were older. Their armor was thinner. Their guns were weaker than the Panther's 75. Crew conditions were brutal. 4 men in a turret designed for 3, no radios in most tanks, ventilation that filled the hull with fumes. Every single specification on paper favored the Panther. But at Prokhorovka on July 12th, when German and Soviet armor collided in the largest tank battle of the war, it was the T-34s that showed up in strength. The T-34s that crossed the ground. The T-34s that closed the range to where their 76mm guns could kill a Panther through the side. Because the T-34s had driven there, and a shocking number of Panthers had not. There is a quote from a German maintenance officer attached to Grossdeutschland, preserved in a Bundesarchiv unit diary. He said, in rough paraphrase, that he had spent more hours recovering Panthers than the gunners had spent firing them. That line travels, because it captures the gap between the legend and the reality. The Panther was a superb fighting machine on the rare occasions it was fighting. Most of the time it was being fixed, towed, or written off. Now let us be honest. Kursk is not the whole story. If we stopped here, we would be lying by omission. By the spring of 1944, the Panther was a different tank. German engineers had quietly addressed many of the worst faults. The final drive remained the weakest link, a known design compromise from the MAN drawings that was never fully corrected. But fuel systems improved, transmissions were reinforced, crews learned the tank's quirks. In Normandy in June and July 1944, Panthers were genuinely fearsome. In the Ardennes in December 1944, they ambushed American columns and caused terror. At long range, in a prepared position, against a frontal attack, the Panther had no peer in its weight class. Allied tank crews feared it. American after-action reports described the psychological effect of a single Panther overwatching a road. That is true, and it is also not the point, because the Panther was conceived as a medium tank, a workhorse, a design meant to be produced in thousands and to carry the weight of German armored doctrine into battle after battle. What it became was a difficult, maintenance-hungry, 45-ton heavy tank wearing medium tank labels. Germany built about 6,000 Panthers across the entire war. The Soviet Union built 84,000 T-34s. The United States built 49,000 Shermans. Quality at scale requires reliability. The Panther, even in its improved form, could not deliver the operational availability numbers that win long campaigns. German units with full Panther establishments routinely reported only 50 to 60% operational readiness even after the bugs were worked out. T-34 units on the same dates reported 80 to 90%. Sherman units in Normandy reported 90+, which means the myth that the Panther was the best medium tank of the war collapses the moment you widen the lens. Best on a test range, maybe. Best in an ambush, arguably. Best across a 6-month campaign involving thousands of kilometers of road march, hundreds of engagements, and a logistics tale measured in trains, not trucks. Not even close. The Sherman won that test. The T-34 won that test. The Panther, in the cold accounting of what an army actually needs, did not. So why does the myth survive? 3 reasons. First, the Panther looked like a winner. Low, wide, aggressive, with that long 75mm gun and that sloped glacis. It photographs like a monster. Every museum piece you see today, polished, painted, static, carries that visual authority. Second, German veterans wrote more memoirs than Soviet veterans. When Guderian, Manstein, and Mellenthin all praise the Panther in their post-war books, that praise becomes the consensus in the English-speaking world. Third, the Panthers that survived to be captured were usually the ones that worked. Sample bias. Allied testing teams evaluated running examples, often late-war upgraded models, and concluded quite reasonably that this was a fine tank. They were not evaluating the 80% that broke down in July 1943. And yet the question matters, still today. Because every modern military faces the same temptation. Build the most advanced system. Accept complexity. Trust that technology will compensate for reliability. The Panther is the cautionary tale that keeps getting ignored. A weapon that cannot show up to the fight is not a weapon. It is a statistic in somebody else's victory report. Cherkaskoye, July 5, 1943. 0600 hours. Colonel Decker stands on a small rise east of the village, binoculars pressed to his face, watching his brigade. Smoke drifts from 3 separate tanks. Not one has been hit. In the valley below, a T-34 battalion is beginning to move, engines rising in pitch, dust climbing behind them. They are coming, and Decker, with 200 of the finest tanks Germany has ever built, cannot meet them with even half that number. He lowers the binoculars. He radios his division commander. He says, in words preserved in the brigade diary, that his Panthers are more dangerous to themselves than to the enemy. Then he orders his surviving tanks forward anyway, because soldiers do what soldiers do. The Panthers that still ran fought bravely. They killed T-34s at long range. They earned the fear of every Soviet crew that crossed their line of sight. And they lost the battle, not because they were outgunned, not because they were out-armored. because they were outrun by a cheaper, uglier, rougher tank that had one quality the Panther could never quite match. It worked. That is the lesson of the Panther. A tank is not what the drawings promise. A tank is what shows up, runs all day, and fires when the enemy appears. Legend is written on test ranges. Victory is written on muddy roads between Belgorod and Oboyan, under rain that will not stop, beside engines that will not start. And that is why, more than 80 years later, when military engineers design a new armored vehicle, the first question they ask is no longer how thick is the armor or how powerful is the gun. The first question is how often does it run? Because the ghost of the Panther, sitting silent in a Ukrainian field in July 1943, is still teaching that lesson to anyone willing to listen.